Whether you're looking for answers to specific life questions or simply hoping to become the best version of you possible, welcome to the Mental Breakdown and Psychreg podcast, where we offer insight, information, and strategies based upon research and years of practice as psychologists. So sit back, have a listen, and get connected with our hosts, Dr. Berney and Dr. Richard Marshall. Welcome back. Richard, this week we're going to make a slight shift in our topics, because last week we talked about anxiety-related disorders, and this week we're going to talk about obsessive-compulsive disorder. And OCD was once considered an anxiety disorder. It's in a category to its own now, but
some people, some writers still include it, include this and other things in under the anxiety disorders. Mm-hmm. Though DSM-5, 2013, does not. Separates them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we now have a category called obsessive compulsive disorders, and so there are a number of things that fall under that broad category.
That chapter is obsessive compulsive and related disorders. Right. So there are other things that come under. So it's a distinct category, and there are other disorders listed within the category of obsessive compulsive disorders. Right. Mm-hmm.
So, but we're going to focus on obsessive compulsive disorder specifically this week.
Right.
Because it's related to a couple of things that we've talked about over the last couple of weeks, not just anxiety disorders, but also autism. Autism spectrum disorders and things like that.
And as we did last week, we will frequently mention anxiety and stress. And so there is a little bit of overlap, but it's important to understand that they are distinct disorders. Right.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're also going to differentiate just through mention that there's a difference between obsessive compulsive disorder and something called obsessive compulsive personality disorder.
Right.
And one is much more impairing than the other. Right. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is much more impairing than obsessive-compulsive personality disorder.
Right.
Because OCPD, obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, is sort of a generalized obsessiveness, compulsiveness that affects a lot of areas of your life or is present in a lot of areas of your life. But it doesn't necessarily have the repetitive behaviors that we see that cause significant impairment like we see with OCD.
I'm never sure how to really distinguish these two things, but one way is that with the personality disorder, the obsessions and the compulsions are not nearly as significant, severe, or debilitating.
Right.
You have a tendency for orderliness and cleanliness and all, but it's not an obsessive, all-consuming.
Right.
You may like to keep things clean, but you don't wash your hands 25 times a day with scalding hot water.
Right.
Okay. You may like to have a bug-free house, but you're not creating a toxic environment by spraying chemicals all over the place. So the obsessions and the compulsions are not nearly as significant or impairing.
Right. So OCD, and OCD is one of those disorders, one of those conditions that a lot of people refer to in passing, almost.
Casually mentioning.
Yeah,
right. Like
it's
so OCD.
Right.
Or I'm OCD.
Yeah, I'm OCD. And what do you mean OCD? Well, I have to put my keys in the same place every time, and I like to put my books where they, back on the shelf where they go. Okay, well, that's not necessarily OCD.
Right.
If you're looking for a really good theatrical depiction of OCD, there is not much better than As Good as It Gets.
As Good as It Gets with Jack Nicholson.
With Jack Nicholson, that is a great depiction of OCD. Now, some of his other tendencies are just part of his personality. Some of that brash, rude, that type of thing is sort of probably just part of his personality, not necessarily part of OCD, but the hand washing.
The hand washing was great.
The
new bar of soap each time. Can you imagine?
And the hot water and having to do it three
Scalding
times.
Scalding hot water.
When he was locking the doors, 1, 2, 3, and so he had to do everything 3 times, and so it's a great depiction. If you haven't seen that film, it's fantastic.
Right. Whoever did that understood the disorder.
They did, absolutely. So, but when it comes to making a diagnosis of OCD, or when we're talking about what it is, we'll just start there. OCD is a condition characterized by the presence of obsessions and compulsions.
And that's important. The or part of that is very important because people typically think you must have both, and you don't.
Right.
You can have one without the other, okay, and you can have either one.
Yeah.
So it's and or compulsions.
Right. So obsessions are repeated thoughts, things that you can't stop thinking about. So this could be, germs or just repetitive thoughts of, it could be anything. It could be related to religion or sex or danger or, any kinds of things, aggression or anything like that.
That's right.
It could be an obsessive thought about anything.
Right. That's right. Anything that, as the name implies,
right,
that you are just either afraid of, concerned about, but it becomes obsessive in the sense that it begins to interfere with everything else. It takes over. And we mentioned that with anxiety, that the anxiety takes over.
Right.
It's the same with this. The obsession takes over.
Right.
It is just, in the movie, As Good as It Gets, he would bring his own silverware to the restaurant because he couldn't stand. We have patients that we see, young children even, who have a fear of germs, for example, and won't touch certain things, and it becomes debilitating.
Right.
The obsession becomes debilitating.
Right, and the another part of the that is counted as obsessions that is relatively common is the need for symmetry and orderliness, and it's not the actual act of making things symmetrical and orderly, because that's the compulsion.
Right.
But it's the internal drive, the internal need. So sometimes we have patients who will sit there and they'll look at the bookcase and they'll say, "Man, that bookcase is driving me crazy because you really need to put this one there and that one there." And
they're not according to. They're
not alphabetical order.
In some way. Right.
And so those types of obsessive thoughts drive people. And make them very frustrated as well.
But that's an important distinction. The compulsions are the behaviors.
Right.
The obsessions are the thoughts.
Right.
Okay. Or the feelings.
Right. Right. And so as we shift to compulsions, compulsions are the behaviors that the person just feels compelled to do. They have this urge, this need to engage in some behavior. Now, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, those compulsive behaviors are related to an obsessive thought. And so the compulsive behavior is done to satisfy the discomfort caused by the obsessive thought. But it doesn't have to be.
Phil Kendall is an expert in this sort of stuff. He teaches at Temple University, and he said it in conference one time that we use our compulsions to manage our obsessions, but not always. Sometimes, Jack. Back to the movie. Jack Nicholson washed his hands frequently because he had a fear of germs. Okay, and so he used the hand washing. But sometimes people have compulsive behaviors, but they're not dealing with anything obsessive.
Right.
They just have to checking. For example, you have to lock the door 3 times. It's not because there's any obsession. It's just, but you have this compulsion.
Right. You're not necessarily sitting there thinking, I have to do it 3 times. Oh my gosh, it has to be 3 times. It has to be 3 times. You're not obsessing over it in that way. It's just that it's what you do when you do that.
That's right.
It's what you do when you lock the door. You do it 3 times, and it has to be balanced that way.
Right.
So,
or you have to do something. You have to do everything 5 times.
Right.
You know, it's not for you don't have any obsession. It's just that this is the way you need to do things.
Right. So we have obsessions, obsessive thoughts. We have compulsive behaviors, and they can occur together, or they can occur in isolation. You can have one or the other.
Right.
And again, to be
consistent with our diagnosis of OCD, you could have either, or you could have both. It doesn't either way.
It's still OCD.
Right. Now, sometimes, so one of the things that we have to be careful of is that we see OCD-like symptoms, behaviors, in other conditions as well.
Right.
Sometimes obsessive compulsive tendencies, especially compulsive behaviors, may look like a tic, or may look like a repetitive behavior like we see with autism, what they call stereotypic behaviors. It may or may not be a compulsion, and we're not always sure, and so sometimes it takes a while to try to tease those things apart.
Right. That's right. But what we're saying with the obsessions is typically they're just certain themes that run through people's lives. And it could be germs, it could be animals, it could be anything. But typically people go in themes.
Right.
And this disorder typically begins in adolescence. That's the other thing. So it's not that children don't have it, but I find that most of the kids that I have who have this, by kids I mean younger than 12, it's more the personality type.
Right.
It's more of a temperament type where they just like to have things orderly.
Right.
So it's really not OCD.
Right.
It's more it's more a reflection of their basic temperament, a need for order and a need for control, perhaps.
Yeah.
But it's not the classic obsessive or compulsive tendencies. Most kids, I don't know that I've seen any. I've seen a few kids who have compulsive disorders where they have to do things. Sometimes they'll come in and say, "Well, no, I have to do it 2 more times because I've only done it 3 times." So that's in my case. In the cases that I have, it's rare. So typically, when you talk to most people, they say, "No, this happened when I was about 14 or 15." I noticed that most of the adults I see, say, "No, I was a teenager and this kicked in."
Yeah. One final piece, and we're going to talk more about this as the week goes, but many times compulsive behaviors could be tied to or related to ritualistic-like behavior. And so one of the things I want to mention is, and we're starting to see some things, a movement away from this because of new rules and stuff, but sort of the classic example is the batter in baseball. He's going up to bat, and he goes through this ritualistic like thing every time, and then he gets up to bat, and then the pitcher throws it to first base, and it's like, okay, so he steps back and he has to go through the whole thing again.
That's funny to watch.
That can be compulsive like. It's usually more superstitious. Because they think the last time I did that sequence of things, I got a good hit or something like that, and so they do it the same way. It just has to feel right. That's a common thing that people with OCD will say, is that I have to do it until it feels right. You have again, kind of sticking with sports. You have those individuals who have to wear the same socks every time they play because those are the good luck socks, and that can kind of teeter into compulsive like needs.
But the reason it's not is because they're only doing it at the ballpark.
Right.
Okay.
Right. It's not impairing.
That's right. It's just, and that's why it's more ritual or habit.
Right.
But I think it's more superstitious rituals that many athletes do.
Right.
I mean, they put their clothes on in exactly the same way because the last time they did that, they won.
Yeah.
So now they have to do it every time.
Yeah.
Or they wore this, but this batting glove thing you mentioned is absolutely fascinating.
Right.
We didn't have batting gloves. Did you have batting gloves when you played baseball? We didn't. Okay.
Yeah.
So I was in pre-batting glove days. So then I would watch the sport afterwards, and they had a batting glove on one hand.
Right. Okay. The bottom hand.
Usually the hand that led.
Right. So the bottom hand, the left hand for the right-handed.
Then both hands had batting gloves on both hands. So, and what you were talking about was when the batter steps out of the batter's box, they have to redo the Velcro, and it is fun. It's kind of fun to do, to slap. You redo your
and they hit the clay out of their cleats, and
there's all these things you go through, but those are more habits,
right?
That you step out of the box, you become aware that they're on, and so you redo them and get everything right so you can get up and hit the ball. which is not an easy thing to do, by the way. But I love to watch the rituals, especially in baseball.
Right. So you're right. They're more ritualistic. If it's the order in which a person puts on clothes, and they're saying that could be just ritualistic, where it would teeter into more concerning would be if it was impossible to get up to bat unless you did that.
Right.
If the person could not tolerate standing in the batter's box until they did all of that, and so if the umpire stopped them and said, "Dude, stop! Get in the batter's box," and you're like, and the person freezes or it's like, I got to do it, then that could be kind of getting more into, or if the person completely falls apart because they can't find those socks that they're supposed to be wearing. They have lots of other red socks, but it's those specific red socks that they need to be wearing. Then you're kind of teetering into more concerning, but especially if it kind of leaks into other areas of life. So you got to be watching for that.
The other thing that we'll mention this probably a couple times during the week, and that's the vicious cycle that you get into with anxiety disorders and obsessive compulsive disorders. You have to do that. You're trying to stop doing it. Okay, once you become aware and you decide that you're going to stop doing it, you try to stop doing it. Well, in trying to stop, you're actually becoming more obsessive.
Right.
Okay. So trying to stop creates even more distress.
Right.
If you have more distress, you become more compulsive. You have more behaviors to do. And so when we get to the treatment phase, we'll talk more about that. But we want to make sure that we avoid the vicious cycle. We talked about it with anxiety. You mentioned it on one of the days that we did anxiety, where in drawing attention to it, you actually make the whole thing worse.
Right.
Okay. And so you get into this vicious cycle, and it's hard to get out of that. So, but we'll talk about more about that later.
Absolutely. So that's it for today. Before we go, we're trying to remind you, as we lead up to the Coming Out of the Darkness, a concert of hope at Theater Winter Haven. It's going to be on May 24th. At 7:30 p.m. This coming Thursday. And if you want more information about this event, go to theaterwinterhaven.com. It's THEATRE winterhaven.com. It's a program with a variety of presenters from the best of Central Florida talent. It's written and directed by Norm Small. It's going to be a great event. I've seen the outline of what they're going to be doing. You'll really enjoy it. All the proceeds are going to go to a local community mental health facility, as well as the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention. So check it out. Call Theater Winter Haven, get some more information, and if you're in the area, head up there. It'll be great.
Right. Suicide rates again are on the rise in youngsters and teenagers. So unfortunately, timely program.
Absolutely. Okay. So, all right, that is it for today. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid. Thanks for sharing this episode of the Mental Breakdown and Psychreg podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to follow us on Twitter and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you will find all of our previous podcasts and much more. We would be honored if you would become a patron through patreon.com, where any donation you can manage will go to the development and creation of more content. Just visit patreon.com/thementalbreakdown for more information. Thanks again for listening. Have an awesome day, and we look forward to being back in your feed tomorrow morning.